It's time to move into the second half of our management and security of our Cisco devices, which is going to be file management. Really, the goal of this video is simple. It's going to demonstrate the different pieces inside of our router, meaning the memory components that are able to store the different files inside of there, and then how to move files to and from those different pieces. By doing that, we are going to be able to do tasks like back up our running config. Maybe we want to store that on a server somewhere just in case something happens to our router. Our routers do break from time to time and we have to replace them, and it's good to have a backup configuration. Or maybe to back up our iOS, our operating system of the router, or to upgrade the iOS to a new version. All of those concepts deal with file management. All of the file management on our Cisco devices focuses around this copy command, which allows us to move files between the memory components. Now, before I focus too much on the copy command, let's look at the memory components and make sure we're all on the same page with those. The first one is RAM. Now, the RAM inside of your Cisco switch or your Cisco router is just like the RAM inside of your PC. The benefit of RAM is it's extremely fast. It's the fastest piece that we have. It runs fast. It's able to read and write very quickly. However, the disadvantage of RAM is that when the power goes out, everything is lost. That means it's volatile. It's all related to the device being on and not being rebooted. Things that are in our RAM that we've seen already is things like our running config. And the router uses the RAM for packet buffers. As packets are coming into the router, it's sticking them in RAM while it figures out what to do with them and looks at its routing table and all of those sort of things. Now, the second piece of memory that we have in our router next to RAM is NVRAM. That is non-volatile RAM. And that is what we see happening or see being used when we type in the command copy running config startup config. We know that is the command that saves our configuration, but really that is a command that copies the running config in RAM to the startup config that is sitting in NVRAM. NVRAM is very small because it only holds the startup config. As a matter of fact, if I go to my prompt here of my router and type in show version, I'll see at the very bottom of that, I've got 191 kilobytes of RAM, or sorry, of NVRAM right here. And that's a lot. That's a lot of NVRAM. A lot of older routers actually have 32K of NVRAM. It's a very small piece because all it's really storing is just a text file that is the running configuration. Now up here, this is where I see my RAM. And the Cisco routers partition their memory. So to really find out how much RAM that is, I have to open a calculator and add those two pieces together. It's 238,592 plus 23552 equals 262,144. Now that is how many kilobytes, you can see the little K right next to that, kilobytes of memory this has. If I want to translate that to megabytes, well, there's 1,024 kilobytes in a megabyte, so I just divide by 1024, enter, and I can see that this router has 256 megabytes of RAM. So that is the RAM sitting right here. This is the NVRAM that stores the startup config. Below that is the flash. That this router has about 60 some megs of flash that is used, this is primarily used to store the iOS, the operating system. And that's what you see when we turn on a Cisco device, a switch or router, and you watch the boot process. You see all these pound symbols flying across the screen. What the router is doing is copying the whole iOS out of flash into RAM. It's actually decompressing it at the same time too, so that the iOS is very responsive and it runs fast. Because flash, just like NVRAM, keeps things when the power goes off, but it's nowhere near as fast as the flash is. Or wait, as the RAM is. Get that? Flash is nowhere near as fast as RAM. So those are the memory pieces inside of our Cisco device. Now, down here you can see this little gray box which says TFTP. It's gray because that is not inside of our Cisco device. That is a server that's running elsewhere. It's known as a trivial file transfer protocol server. It actually, if you're using a firewall or something like that, it uses UDP. It's one of the UDP protocols, port 69. And that server is used to copy files to and from our routers. So if I want to copy from the flash, I want to back up my iOS to the TFTP server, I can do that by copying from flash to TFTP. Now, the first question we have to answer is, where do you get a TFTP server? Well, thankfully, it's very cheap. It's very inexpensive because it's free. You can just set up a Windows box or a Macintosh or in just about any platform supports TFTP. I'll tell you on Windows, the best place to go is this website right here. This is tftpd32.jonin.net. Just so you don't have to remember that, you can just go to Google and type in tftp32, and that is going to be the first hit on Google right here, this description. It is a free TFTP server that is very simple. You just scroll down right here that shows kind of a screenshot of it, and near the bottom it has, oh, I can't squeeze up my screen anymore. Near the bottom, it has a download link right here where you can just get this for free. You just stick it on Windows and it works. So when you install it, this is what it looks like. And I can copy files to and from my Windows PC. You can see the current directory. I have it going to a TFTP folder on my desktop. And the IP address that my server is using, 192.168.1.50. So this little tab right here allows it to be a TFTP server, and now my router or switch can copy files to this device. So now that you've seen the memory components, let's talk a little bit about the copy command. I'm going to bring my router interface back up here and do let's see, what am I going to do? Oh, let's keep it simple first of all. I'm going to save my configuration. We've been typing in copy running config to startup config. That's been how we save. It says, what do you want to name the file? By default, it's going to be startup config, and that's what we want to keep it at. So I'm just going to hit enter on the keyboard to accept that default name. Shows building configuration. It's copying right now, and you can kind of get the feel of how slow NVRAM is because it shouldn't take that long to save a little text file. I mean, that text file is very small. So it is a very slow device. So that's how we've been saving our configuration, but I'm going to do a copy question mark. And you can see that it comes up and says, copy, what do you want to do? Do you want to erase a file system, verify and all that? But down here I can see all my file systems on my router. Flash, NVRAM right there. We have system right here, which is actually considered RAM. I see TFTP down here and a lot of other things. In the newer iOS versions, you can copy to HTTP servers, like web servers to and from HTTP servers. You can use the FTP protocol, which has been around quite some time as well. So there's a lot of different ways that we can copy. Now let's say I wanted to copy a backup of my configuration, meaning I want to save my configuration on that TFTP server. Well, all I need to do is type in copy running config space and do that question mark, and you can see that the option it gives me is TFTP. It's one of my options. So I'll type in copy running config space TFTP. Enter. Now it comes up and asks, what is the address or name of the remote host? Now I have that right here, 192.168.1.50. So that is what my TFTP server is running on. It says, what do you want to name the file when you copy it over there? By default, it's going to say router2 config right there as the file name. I usually like to put r2 config dot doc or something like that, so that or just do .text, so that it will open with Notepad or something by default in Windows. Otherwise, it won't know what application to use to open that file. I hit enter, and we can see 2 exclamation points. The TFTP server, it was so fast, it just kind of blinked right there, and now received the files. Now it's going to put it in this directory, which is on my desktop. So if I open that directory, I can see that I now have r2config.txt. If I double click that, actually, I'm going to right click that and say open with WordPad. Sometimes Notepad doesn't doesn't like the formatting. Right there is a complete backup of my router's entire configuration. So I have that now as a backup. Now I can take that concept and I can apply it to just about anything. I could go to, let me do a show flash and see what's in there. I can see there's a whole bunch of stuff in there. Typically, the very first file will be your iOS. If you're ever wondering, well, which one is my iOS? That's where that show version command comes in handy, because the show version command will say the system image file, meaning the iOS, is this right there, flash colon that. So I can do a show flash and try and locate that file in flash, which right here you see it's the same file. So if I wanted to back up my operating system, which is a good practice, it's good to have that on a server somewhere so that you can retrieve it if you ever need it. I can type in copy flash to TFTP. Now that's the easiest way sometimes to do it, because it's going to walk you through step by step, asking you questions. But you could actually do this all on one line. I could put copy flash colon, and by the way, copy and paste is your friend when it comes to these iOS names. They are very prone to mistypes with all the dots and dashes. So I just copy and paste that in there. I say I want to copy from flash that to TFTP colon forward slash forward slash. It's kind of like a web string that you would type into your web browser. And I could put 192.168.1.50, that's the IP address, forward slash, and then paste again. That's the file name that I would like to use. I hit enter, and it comes up, and everything's already filled in for me. I just need to confirm. Is that the host? Yep. Is that the file name? Yep. I hit enter, and you can see right now it's copying across. I bring up my TFTP server, and now you can see a little action happening. You can see that the file is being received by from the host, and it's being copied over there. You can see how many bytes are being copied. It takes a little while because Flash is so slow. That's one of the reasons that we use RAM. We copy the whole iOS into RAM when the router boots up. So that's being copied right now. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video while that happens because it's going to take a few moments. All right, there we go. The copy is finished, and I now, if I open my TFTP folder, I now have a copy of the entire iOS, which you can see is about 32 megabytes in size. Compare that to Windows, and it's very small. But that's the iOS that I've backed up. So this copy command can move things all around on my router to be able to manage the different pieces of my router. Now, I can also restore things from the TFTP server by just typing in copy TFTP, kind of reverse the order here, to Flash. That would be maybe upgrading the iOS, or copy TFTP to run. Now there is something I do want to mention. When you are copying things to the running config, the iOS always merges them. Meaning, if you have, let's say, a backup config on the TFTP server that is a known good configuration, it's great, and you've been doing some changes on your router, and you just really kind of goof things up and lost track of where you are, and you're just like, you know what, that's it, I just want to get back to my original config. Well, if you copy from TFTP to RAM, it will actually merge the two configurations together. So for example, if the config in TFTP says your IP address on fast Ethernet 0/0 is 10.1.1.1, and the one in RAM says it's 10.1.1.2, well, when you copy, the TFTP will replace that because it's a direct conflict. So your new IP address is 10.1.1.1. Now that's the good side. The bad side of merge is you're trying to get rid of a bunch of stuff you did. So maybe you had some let's see, what other configure, some NAT configuration on here in RAM that didn't exist in the TFTP configuration. So you added some NAT commands and you just want those to go away. Well, when you copy the TFTP config over here, since the NAT commands didn't exist in the TFTP config, it merges and the NAT commands will still exist. It just replaces anything that directly conflicts. So that's the idea of merging. So how do you fix your config? I mean, if it's really hosed up and you want to replace it, well, that's where you can actually do a copy TFTP to startup config. The startup config, if you copy to there, does not merge, it replaces. Replace. So when I copy from TFTP to NVRAM, it will throw away whatever config is there and replace it with this. Now, you're stuck with a router that has a bad config in RAM and a good config in NVRAM. How do you restore that? You reboot. That's the only way to do it, because copy from start to run will also do a merge. Anything to the running config is a merge. So by rebooting, you flush everything that's in RAM. Remember, anytime you lose power, everything disappears and it replaces it with a fresh copy of what was in NVRAM. So that's how we can restore our config. I'll just give you an example of that. I'll say copy TFTP to startup config. Says what is the IP address of the remote host? We'll say 192.168.150. That's our TFTP server. What is the source file name? That's this guy right here. Let's copy that whole thing. Copy and paste. The destination file name needs to be startup config. I don't want it to be R2 config because the router only looks for that on boot up. I hit enter, says I'm accessing that, loading that, okay. It's now writing that. You can see the delay because NVRAM's very slow. It's writing that to NVRAM right now and replacing the existing startup config. So once I reboot this router, there we go, it's now back up, we will have a fresh copy of whatever configuration existed on that TFTP server. One more thing I want to show you because it's kind of related to these copy commands, and that is the boot system command. Now, if you wanted to upgrade your iOS, a lot of times people will go in there and delete the iOS from Flash and copy a new iOS into Flash from the TFTP server. And you can get an iOS from Cisco's website as long as you pay them money for a support contract. But the safer way to do it is actually to allow your router to boot up using a TFTP server. Here's the idea. I want to upgrade my iOS. Hang on, let me get rid of all this. I want to upgrade my iOS to a new version. Well, what I can do is I can keep the current version in Flash because I know that one works, and I know that if all else fails, you know, and everything blows up, I can always go back to the iOS that's sitting in Flash. So what I do is I go to Cisco's website, put in my support contract code, and download a new version of the iOS to the TFTP server. So we have the iOS now sitting on the TFTP server, and we have a known good one sitting in Flash. I should also mention, iOS upgrades don't always go well. Meaning, you might upgrade the iOS and you upgrade to a buggy version or just a version that doesn't work with your configuration. It's dangerous. So a lot of times, iOS upgrades need a scheduled window of outage for the network where you are doing maintenance to that. So you download the iOS to the TFTP server and boot the router from the TFTP server rather than using the iOS in Flash. That way, if this iOS ends up being bad, all I have to do is say, oh, sorry, let's just go back to booting from Flash again and use the old iOS that was working. The way that we can do that is by using boot system commands. If you go into global configuration mode, you can type in boot system, which tells, you know, how do you boot this system, and then we can put in anything from Flash, from TFTP, from there's other things like DECNEC mop servers. those aren't used anymore. So I could type in TFTP : //192.168.1.50 / and then, you know, put whatever iOS version I want right there. Paste. Poof. At that point, the next time the router boots, it's going to first try and load its iOS from the TFTP server, and if it's not there or unavailable, it will revert to Flash as a backup and try and boot from Flash. So those boot system commands can really help you during your iOS upgrades. Once you know that this iOS works and has been tested from the TFTP server, then you can copy it to the Flash of your router and boot it from there just as normal. That is all there is to moving files to and from the different memory components of your router using the copy command, and even moving them off your router to a separate server. And with that, we've actually reached the official end of this CVT Nuggets video series on ccent. I do plan on adding one more video specific to test takers, but I'm not going to add any more actual content in this series at this point. So I know At this point, you have to be feeling much more confident with your abilities on Cisco routers and switches than you were when you started this series. And I hope this information will be valuable to you, no matter if you're using it directly for the certification exam or you're using it in the real world. You're actually going to walk into your company now and get on the Cisco switches and routers and manage them using all the skills that we've learned as we've been through this series. I hope to see you in a future series in CBT Nuggets, and until then, I hope this information has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.